they analyzed it, like it was very probabilistic with the way that they thought about things, like
doing interesting things and asking interesting questions.
Do you happen to remember that question?
I do. I don't think I'm ever going to forget it.
You don't want to solely rely on evidence. You don't want to solely rely on your prior beliefs. You kind of have to have like a mix of both, if that makes sense. Besides all of that,
then it comes out that gold is worth nothing, but we still use the same, I don't know, it's a terrible analogy, but like the same bartering rules and approach. Like, it just
wanting to model for other people what I've been preaching my whole career. In order to make progress, you have to sort of reach across the aisle and be that kind of person.
Like, I don't know, like 10 years ago, maybe we didn't have like war and like all this grading and everything, and it just adds like more and more context to like a player or a game or like the season as a whole. So I don't know, I think it's great, and I've only really known football analytics like with all of that.
Welcome to Pardon My Math, episode 4 with Colin Dunphy, and today's guest is Amelia Probst. How are you today, Amelia?
Hey, Colin. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Super excited for today's episode. It's been so much fun preparing for this. We're going to talk about the intersection of grading with EPA, and we're going to talk about your history and wonderful career. But before we do that, can you tell us about maybe the moment or like the story of how you got into analytics, if you remember it?
Yeah, so I can't say there was one specific moment. So when I was in college, I actually started in the engineering college and quickly decided that wasn't for me. So that's how I switched into statistics. And so segueing into that, I had like always loved watching sports, playing sports, like ever since I was little. And so my thought process was kind of like, well, if I can combine my like love for sports and then my major, like that'd be awesome. So it kind of just was a process of figuring out what I wanted to do by like talking with people who worked in sports analytics and figuring out if that's actually what I wanted to do, and just getting relevant experience. So that was kind of like the process of leading up to where I am now. And obviously I've enjoyed my time as a data scientist and as like an analyst. So I've just continued along that path.
I understand you've worked in lacrosse and baseball. Can you tell us about your experience with that and how it's helped you learn about analytics?
Yeah, so working in lacrosse and baseball, which are, I would say, two different ends of the spectrum in terms of their analytics journey, I would say, and baseball is a lot farther ahead of them and even farther ahead of football analytics. So that was really interesting to have experiences on like both sides of the spectrum. And I feel like it gave me a different perspective than other people who maybe just focus on one sport. So it was cool to see like how lacrosse is still, growing in terms of analytics and being involved in like, the data collection process and more of like the nitty gritty things that I don't do in my like day-to-day job now. And I've also learned that you can apply concepts across sports, like war is in baseball and football. So I think that was a big takeaway that I had, was just seeing how I can apply like similar concepts or like theories or whatever it is to football or like what I do now. And at the end of the day, like most of the sports are pretty similar. They all want like to win and like have good players and be able to evaluate everything that's going on in the game. So that's really what it comes down to. And that's like the building blocks of analytics. So I think being able to work in baseball and lacrosse really showed me like from start to finish how like analytics has grown and will continue to grow. And it's cool to like be able to apply that in football now in my current role.
So you're a data scientist at PFF, graduated from Cornell in 2022, Premier Lacrosse League intern, and you work for the Mets. You're also a Bills fan. Yeah. Is there anything else that you think I left out or you'd like our, viewers and listeners to know?
I think that pretty much sums it up. But I guess one thing I will add, because I feel like people always ask me, like, how did you get these opportunities, or like what led you to these specific opportunities? And this might not be the answer that people want to hear, but it is a lot of luck, I would say. And then a mentor of mine told me a quote, and I don't know who it's from originally, but he told me that luck is where opportunity meets preparation. And I think that's something that I always strive for, was to be prepared, at least when I was in college, like to when opportunities came up, that I would be prepared to, you know, go through these interviews and like have the skills that they were looking for. And so I think that's like a little tidbit of advice I would give to people if they're looking to break into sports analytics is just be as prepared as you can. And you're going to get probably a lot of no's, and I did as well. And that's just part of the process. It's a numbers game. So yeah, luck is like a big reason why I got to where I am. And yeah, it's been an interesting process for sure, like getting to where I am. But I've met a ton of great people along the way, and I'm really grateful for all the opportunities that I've had.
Going back to lacrosse, I think that's really interesting. You know, Tej talked about the importance of looking at other sports as well in our first episode. And so I played lacrosse in high school and a little bit in college. I wasn't very good, but I think it's interesting. So like I pulled a study that you did, and can you tell us about this shooting distance and accuracy by position graph that I have on the screen here?
Yeah, so I made this when I was an intern at the Premier Lacrosse League, and I just kind of wanted to test my data analysis and visualization skills while I was there. So this was a product of that. And since I did have access to a lot of data that's, you know, not publicly available, so this basically showed that if you're closer to the goal at any position besides, you know, like long stick midfielder, your shooting percentage is most likely going to be better. But the main goal of this for me and like for posting this was, you know, to better my skills, get feedback, and just use like data that I had available to me, because especially as a college student and even as someone who doesn't work in sports, you may not have access to a lot of data that you would like, just because it's not publicly available most of the time. So having like this opportunity, I also wanted to share these results with other people. And like I mentioned earlier, like lacrosse analytics is still in its infancy. So kind of getting the word out there and like getting this to the right crowd who'd be really interested in it was also like part of my goal as an intern.
And so on the x-axis, we see the distance and the shooting percentage on the top. So like if this was like a football thing, maybe it would be like distance of a throw and completion percentage or something like that. The farther you throw it, maybe the completion percentage goes down.
Yeah, similar.
And so in the first episode, we also talked about expected points. And so I thought it was really cool to see that there's you talked about an expected goals added model. Can you tell us about that and how it might compare to what we talk about as expected points in football?
Yeah, so expected goals added is similar to expected points, but it takes into account different variables, obviously, like distance from the goal, angle, if it was assisted, etc. And expected goals added is only calculated on shots, whereas EPA, or like expected points added, is on every play. So basically, like expected goals added is the statistical chance of like a given shot becoming a goal. And then obviously, like, but depending on the play type, so if it was a missed goal, a missed shot, like even though it was missed, it like gave you a higher chance at a goal essentially. And then obviously expected points, that model is a little different because you can score obviously different amounts of points, like so 3 for a field goal, obviously 6 for a touchdown, etc. So you do have to account for that, and obviously it takes into account like down, distance, other variables. So they are similar in concept, I guess, but different in like application, I would say. And there's also like, I think expected goals is also something that they use in soccer. So it's something that is used like across different sports for sure.
And I like here on the screen here, for anyone who's following, there's a table you have for missed shot, like, and the value for that, and the penalty, and like an assisted goal. And so all these values, it reminds what we see with like EPA, where it's like, oh, this is the amount for completion, and this is the amount for an incompletion and a sack. Can you explain the difference between charting and grading?
Yeah, so charting is more detailed in terms of like giving us location information, like basic statistics, all of that, like EPA, what have you. And grading, at least in terms of PFF grading, like I mentioned, they grade each individual player on each play. So it doesn't depend on the result. Obviously, like the result may help. Like, so if a receiver gets a touchdown, like they're probably going to be graded more highly, but there are more factors that go into it. And I would say grades are like a little bit easier for people to grasp and like understand than EPA and play-by-play data and things like that, because you're simplifying a lot of that data into one number, like whether it's across the season or a game or career, whereas like EPA, like when you look at it, if it's like a decimal, people are like, oh, well, what does that mean? Like they don't know everything that goes into it. Whereas like a 0 to 100 grade is a lot more intuitive. So yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit more about like event tracking data?
Yeah, so event tracking data, at least I'll talk about it specifically in lacrosse, like it's usually, you know, their X and Y location, probably what kind of play it was, like if it was a turnover, if it was a shot, if it was assisted, angle, distance, etc. And I would say in the NFL, it's a little more complicated now that we have like physical tracking data. So like every second or every like half second or something, they track like the X and Y location and many other variables of every like player that's on the field in football. So it's definitely more detailed when it comes to NFL or like football, I guess I would say. And I think, like I mentioned, lacrosse is getting there, but it just takes a lot more manpower and a lot more like funding to get there. So I think eventually lacrosse will get there, but we'll see. But for now, as far as I'm aware, and when I worked at the PLL, event tracking like in lacrosse is, you know, done by looking at film and not, you know, they don't have chips in like the vests or anything like that. So yeah, definitely like a work in progress, and the NFL is definitely more detailed in terms of their process and like what they track and how many variables they track and all of that, which is good and bad in my opinion. Sometimes, you know, there's like data overload and too many things, whereas sometimes I think like keeping things simple can be better. But yeah, obviously like there's just so much data now, not even in sports, but like in other businesses as well. That there's just so much to do with it, which is really fun. But yeah.
When I'm trying to research lacrosse analytics and the state of it now, and, you know, I'm learning all of this, to be honest, you know. What it reminded me though was kind of like some of the stuff they talk about in this book, The Hidden Game of Football, where like it was a lot of box score stats. And they would go back in history and like data would be, you know, splotchy, inconsistent. I guess big picture as it is, like if we're just pretending for our viewers, you know, like our viewers, we've learned EPA, we've learned about QBR with Ben Alamar and just kind of like analytics in general, but then also success rates. So like if this is our world and, you know, we're basing all of this on starting, do you see an analogy between like that type of perspective on football as like lacrosse, and that like you don't have tracking or grading?
Yeah. So I think football and lacrosse are obviously like very different sports, and I think the thing about football that makes it so hard to like grade and track and everything like that is that it is a team sport, and lacrosse is too. But you know, like for example, like offensive, defensive line, like they're a unit and like they have to work together. Otherwise, you know, it just doesn't work. Whereas in lacrosse, it's a lot more individual. So like personally, I could see if there was grading for lacrosse players, like it would be a lot more simpler just because you can isolate one person a lot more easily on that field versus in football where like in certain positions, like they work together. And I think that's why it's so hard to really like quantify the value of a player in any sport, but like specifically in football, because you just can't take into account all the factors that are, you know, unquantifiable essentially. So I think it really depends on the sport you're looking at, but I think, like I said, you can apply a lot of the same or like similar concepts across sports. So I think eventually we'll get there in lacrosse at least. But yeah, I think it's also great to look back at like how far football has come. Like before, like I don't know, like 10 years ago, maybe we didn't have like WAR and like all this grading and everything, and it just adds like more and more context to like a player or a game or like the season as a whole. So I don't know, I think it's great, and I've only really known football analytics, like with all of that. So for me, it like is a whole different perspective, like thinking about it without having like all this data and like metrics at my fingertips.
So I wanted to shift now to your work for PFF. All season long, I saw that you were doing 2 weekly installments. One was a analytic quarterback rankings, and the other one was a power ranking. So we're going to talk a little bit about those. So can you tell us a little bit about Bayesian statistics and kind of like your approach here? And, to help this, I pulled a study from 2019 that Kevin Cole did with this graphic here on the screen for us. And it shows, for anyone that's listening and not viewing, it shows a wide bell curve called prior beliefs, and then like a higher, narrower bell curve called posterior beliefs. And then as we're going further to the right, it's evidence in like a shorter. So can you tell us about Bayesian statistics, please?
Yeah, so I guess I'll first start off with just talking about like normal statistical analysis and what most people are used to. So basically we base our analysis and get like insights just from the evidence. So like the rightmost curve. And so Bayesian statistics is that we give weight to these prior beliefs before any evidence is collected. So this far left curve is like what you weight your beliefs with. So that's called like obviously the prior. And so essentially what you do is you update like your probability for like a hypothesis as like more and more evidence is given to you. And so that's what makes up the posterior. So the reason it's like in between the two is because you don't want to solely rely on the evidence. You don't want to solely rely on your prior beliefs. You kind of have to have like a mix of both, if that makes sense. So in Kevin Cole's study specifically, he updates like the normal distribution of like passing skills that we have based on their draft position, which is our prior belief, and then their actual pass grades, which is our evidence. So this like new distribution is based on like the individual passer could have like more of a range of outcomes. So it's not just based on the prior beliefs and it's not just based on the evidence. It's like a mix of the two essentially. So you're like updating all of that.
And so how did you take this methodology into your study, of analytical QB rankings?
Yeah, so like I said, you want to update your beliefs like as you get more evidence. So obviously we give weight to our like prior beliefs before any evidence is collected. But so for this specific example, for the analytical QB rankings, as the season went on, you like continue to update your prior beliefs based on like the past week and their performance. So that's how I would update like their ratings and their EPAs, like season-long EPAs and season-long ratings. So that's just what I went about on a weekly basis. And I mean, it was a pretty simple process. You're just updating like the model every week, and it, spits out it spits out numbers, but you put them into rankings. So yeah, it sounds like kind of complicated, but it's more of a simple process than you would think.
Thank you. Yeah, it really has helped me learn, just to even follow conversations on Twitter. Now I think I understand a little bit more when people are talking about priors. We've talked now about your analytic QB rankings project. You also did a power rankings project, and there were 4 graphs in particular I wanted to talk about. And so this first one I'm pulling from your week 18 power rankings article. So can you please explain offensive drive success, what that is?
Yeah, so offensive drive success in this instance is like the percentage of drives that end in a score. So that could be a touchdown, field goal, what have you. And then a defensive drive success is the opposite. So like they want to prevent scores. And then play success rate, on the other hand, is just the percentage of plays that like get positive yardage or score. So anything that's like basically not negative or 0 like yardage, or like, interception, something like that. And so I chose drive success rate in this case because when looking at offenses, that's what really matters is scoring. Like you could drive all the way down the field, but if you end up having an interception or a fumble or what have you, like that doesn't really contribute to the offensive success as a whole. Whereas if you're looking at play success rate, like you could have a really high percentage of like play success rate, and like because you went all the way down the field. But if you didn't score, it doesn't really take into account that. And on the defensive side as well, like you want to see if the defense got a 3 and out, if they got an interception, and the defense wants to prevent scores as much as possible. So I thought this was the simplest way to look at offensive drive success as a whole for a team, because the end goal is to score.
You're reminding me of the game that we looked at throughout this series so far. We've been talking about the Commanders when they played Dallas on Thanksgiving. In that game, Sam Howell had like I think like a decent success rate. I think it was like upper 40s, but it had a really bad EPA per play, and it came down to a lot of negative plays. So he had a high success rate, but those drives weren't successful. And your chart would show that difference, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's really where we've gotten to in football analytics is like the little things make a huge difference, like interception or a sack or fumble, whatever. Like you have to look at the whole picture. You can't just look at, one specific metric. And that's like the great thing, but sometimes also the frustrating thing is like you have to look at more than one metric or, multiple things. That's why I chose this specifically. I wanted to make it as simple as possible and like as easy for people to understand. And I thought this was the best way.
Now, another graph I saw that was very interesting was you were evaluating lineman performance using PFF grades for the offensive line and defensive line. Can you explain what these things capture that like EPA and success rate does not?
Yeah, so for our offensive and defensive line grades, this is the grade of the offensive line like as a unit. So essentially they're like aggregated together in a way. And so it's like not how well like the defense performed like against them, or how the quarterback like went through the defensive line, or something like that. So like for example, the offensive line, like, so the quarterback may have gotten sacked, but the offensive line may not have necessarily been responsible for it. So the offensive lineman still might have gotten a good grade. So that's something that like they take into account. Whereas like success rate are like results based. And like for EPA, for example, you would get a negative EPA on a sack play because the play outcome was not good. So it's more results based, whereas the grades, like you grade every play, not the result. So you grade every player on the play. So you grade like each specific lineman in this case, not like the result of the play because they may have not been responsible for it. And I think another thing that I would like to point out is that like success rate is how the offense or defense did as a whole. If they did score, like it doesn't show how they scored, like what led up to that. Whereas the grades have a little more depth to it. They don't provide more details in necessarily like just by looking at the grade, but in PFF player tracking at least, every player is assigned a grade on every play. So even though you don't see that in like the player's grade as a whole, like seeing each individual player's outcome of like every game, you can tell the difference. So like every offensive lineman or defensive lineman is not going to have the same grade for every game, for instance.
I wasn't able to find a slide for this, but I've just really enjoyed going back and learning about the history of like football and like and stuff. So I came across this game in 1913. It was Army versus Notre Dame, and it was just like it's supposed to be like the inception of the forward pass. And so like Newt Rockne, like his thing was like he would pretend that he was injured, and they would be like 3 short passes, and he would be like hobbling along, and then on like the 4th like pass, he would like run as fast as he wasn't a very fast runner, so like he had to use this deception. That was kind of like the way they explained it, and so. He got like a 40-yard touchdown. And so I guess this is my little story. I mean, like charting would never really show that. It would just be like, 40-yard touchdown. But with grading and with tracking, you can kind of say like how and like why.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been like that always from the beginning. Like, I mean, like there's always been a deception or a need to know how.
Yeah, for sure. And now with like more and more tracking data being available, you can like, look at the nearest defender to a player. Like, was it the defender's kind of like fault, or like whose fault was it, or was it like the receiver who like, you know, went into an open like lane, something like that. So it just adds a lot more depth to it, like you were saying.
So now we're moving to the third one, defensive efficiency. So can you tell us about this graph, please, and what you were trying to do?
Yeah, so the reason I chose using EPA per play for pass and run specifically, I wanted to separate them because I feel like EPA per play just shows how effective teams are in certain situations. So like if a team has a higher EPA per play, whether it's on run or passing situations, like it's more likely that they're moving down the field and scoring. But obviously we know that some teams are better at running versus passing, or vice versa. And at least in this case, I applied it to defenses because, you know, maybe they can stop the run, but they're not efficient against the pass. So they're like two separate parts of the game that I wanted to show. And again, like I said, for a previous graphic, I just wanted to make it as simple as possible and like it's easy for people to understand. So even though like one of these defenses, like the Browns, for example, obviously they're very good in both categories, but it's still helpful to see, you know, which one they may be, like if they're better against the run or against passing situations. It just helps like break it down a little more and give more context to the defense in this case as a whole.
Very cool. Finally, the fourth graph was where you have WAR, loss to injuries. That's wins above replacement. Can you tell us about why you chose that graph, please?
Yeah, so for WAR, which is, like you said, wins above replacement, it's essentially assigning value to a player. And in this case, I wanted to look at how injuries affected teams, because obviously we know like when there's injuries to like the star players, like Myles Garrett or something like that, we know that's going to really impact a team, and that's like pretty obvious. But there are other players who also contribute and maybe like more minor roles, but you don't necessarily hear about them or see them. But WAR kind of like, in this case, takes into account how much they contribute to a team, essentially. And then I just split it into offense and defense because, you know, some teams may have more offensive injuries, some teams may have more defensive injuries. And I just wanted to display that in a way that was easy to understand. And I just thought it was a less complex way of showing the overall picture of a team besides like, you know, listing every player that was injured on the team. And WAR is like pretty stable over time, like from year to year. So I feel like it's something that you can use and be like pretty confident about. And then WAR is also used in baseball in a similar way. So I felt like it would be a familiar concept to people who maybe aren't like super familiar with football analytics, but like wanted to, you know, maybe get more into it or what have you. And I just thought this was an easy way to show injuries and how that affects a team or could potentially affect a team, because there aren't many metrics out there probably besides WAR that you could use to encapsulate like impact of injuries on a team. In terms of the power rankings, what I wanted to do was just give people a good idea of how and why we ranked teams certain ways. And obviously we want to do this with as little bias as possible, but we are human, so there's obviously some unconscious bias involved usually. But essentially, like we wanted to take an analytical approach to teams and like these rankings rather than using our own personal opinions and like how we think they're going to do. So that's like our approach at PFF in general. But then for this like specific article, that's what we also wanted to do. And of course, like I mentioned before, there are certain things you can't account for, like the Lions, for example, like they did really well this year, and like people maybe didn't think that was going to be the case. So like there's some factors, at least I think within like the Lions specifically, that like they did so well because of some factors you can't account for, whether that's like personality or what have you, like coaching, things like that. So I think those things you can't necessarily quantify, or we can't quantify at this moment. So those are some things that, you know, may have gone into like these rankings subconsciously, and like just something that's always interesting to think about, because like I mentioned, there are things that happen every week in the NFL that like are not predicted and are just like seem really unlikely to happen, but they do.
Yeah, really appreciate your work on that. And it brought about an analogy that I wanted to get your feedback on. I've been listening to a book, Noise by Daniel Kahneman, and it talks about judgment and the importance of having like multiple people like viewing a judgment from like different perspectives. And so like, yeah, do you think kind of like as we're talking about charting, player grading, and like now the inception of player tracking data, like this GPS stuff, and then like the old school scouting reports, is it all kind of like working together to help complete the picture on like how to make a judgment on what they're seeing, all seeing it from different angles?
I think that's the ultimate goal. And obviously, I think it's different for every team and organization. But you can't just rely on like one of these things to tell you about like a player or a game or what have you. And like I said, there are certain things that you can't necessarily quantify, and like we know that. But I think like, for example, for the draft, like a lot of teams rely on all four of these things to come to a consensus about a player because they value all of these things. Maybe not value them all the same or like at the same level, but similarly enough that they take them into account when they're like, creating their draft models or what have you. So I think even though these come from like, different areas and different perspectives, I think they're all important and they've all kind of, stuck around for a reason. And I think that is the hardest part though, is combining all four of these things because they're all so different. And like, how do you assign like a value to them or like weight them in certain ways? I think that's something that we're still figuring out, and I can't speak to the team side, but I would think similarly, especially when it comes to the draft. Like we all know that the draft is probably like the hardest thing to predict, like who's going to be successful, who's not. So I think it'll be interesting to see how all these things come together in the future. And if it'll help teams draft better, I'm not sure. We'll see. But yeah, the draft is an interesting like outlier, I guess I would say.
So we talked about charting and grading. Can you talk about how they may have played a role in your study on offensive line volatility?
Yeah, in this case, I mainly use grading to determine volatility at least, but then obviously like block success rate was determined by charting in this case. So my main takeaway from this, like you said, like less volatility is better, whether you're a good lineman or not. But ultimately, like I think offensive linemen are, and defensive linemen too, but mainly offensive linemen are understudied, even though their performance is like some of the most valuable on the field, and like their changes in their performance can really affect the outcome of plays and games. But obviously you can see in this graphic, like some of the best offensive linemen are up at the top right of this graphic. So like the less volatile they are, the more consistent they are in their performance, and sure, they could be more consistent, like / less volatile and not perform as well. But obviously like there's a reason that, like Creed Humphrey and Trent Williams are up there on the top of this graphic, like they're doing something right. And I think that's something that you could take even further, specifically to offensive linemen, like with their hand movements or like the way they move their feet. Like they have to be really consistent in that, and that's just something they practice. And obviously my work didn't take into account that because we don't have that data, but like something I've thought about in the future is like looking at that specific movement, because that is really important to offensive linemen and defensive linemen as well. But yeah, I think offensive linemen are just like very much not underappreciated, but understudied for sure. So that's a big reason why I wanted to do this specific work.
Yeah, I loved the study, and you continue with the work to do a volatility over expected graph. So can you tell us what we can get from this?
Yeah, so essentially volatility over expected, you take their performance and you predict like their past performance, and you predict what you think their volatility is going to be like in the future. And so essentially you compare what their like predicted volatility would be versus their actual volatility. And so that's how you determine volatility over expected. And so essentially this graphic is not as much, black and white, I would say, as the previous one. But again, you can see that the players who are less volatile than expected, so you can see like Jason Kelsey, Trent Williams, other people like that, they're way less volatile than they're expected to be, and they're like good at what they do, which is blocking. So even though it's not like a super strict trend line like the other graphic, you can still see that for the most part, players who are less volatile than they're expected to be do better and perform better, and that affects like their performance as a player, but also their performance like on the line as a whole, because like I mentioned earlier, offensive line is like really like a unit, and they all have to work together. And so I think that's something that's really important in their aspect of the game.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's like a new kind of frontier of football. So I'm very excited to see your work and where you continue with this, Amelia. I wanted to switch now to like community kind of questions, like you alluded to. I find it really valuable. So can you, talk about how you think fans can use analytics to enrich their experience?
Sure. So I think in my experience, using analytics, whether that's like as a casual fan or as a more serious fan, it's definitely a very like personal decision. Like maybe people don't want to like use stats to like or advanced metrics to enhance their experience. So like even for me as a data scientist, like, and I work in football every day, sometimes when I'm watching football, I just want to, disconnect from the analytics part of my brain a little bit and just watch for fun. But I think it can definitely enhance your experience for sure. You can like get more insights into like trends that are going on across the league, performance of like your team, or like within a season. It can even help you understand coaches' decisions, especially I feel like this past season with fourth down decisions, that's been a very controversial thing for whatever reason. And like specifically other things that happen in games and like the likelihood of all those things happening. So I think at the end of the day, it can enhance your experience if you want it to, but I don't think you have to have analytics to like enjoy the game more. I think it's all a personal decision. But I think if you want to really get into like the nitty gritty, like you were talking about, like understanding more details of what goes into certain aspects of the game, it could definitely help you. And there's even resources out there where you can specifically work with football data. There's a package in R called NFL Fast R, and I would definitely recommend that because it's probably the closest you're going to get to like what like real data looks like. I mean, it is real data, but like it's not as detailed as, for instance, like PFF data, but it's pretty good. So if you're really like interested, you can, come up with your own metrics or do your own research, and like that can lead you to like asking better questions and like just becoming a more informed fan. So I think there are lots of opportunities out there if you want to enhance your experience like with analytics. So yeah.
And can you think possibly of an example of how like maybe getting into analytics or like a certain project may have brought about like starting a relationship with or a friendship with someone that, like you didn't expect or that became meaningful, or what do you think?
Sure. Yeah. So Dr. Eric Eager was my former boss at PFF. He's now at Seymour Sports, but he really encouraged me to do my offensive line volatility work that we talked about, because that was my first project when I was at PFF, and like I really got to dive into all the data I had access to and like do something that I was really passionate about. So he really encouraged me and supported me throughout that. And so it was a great learning experience because obviously he's like a football analytics savant, basically. So he taught me a lot. And then obviously like we were great friends. So being able to like just talk about football with him or analytics in general or, whatever, it was a really fun time. And even though we no longer work together, we're still like really good friends. And I feel like I've just learned a lot from him, as well as other people in the sports analytics industry. But getting their feedback, and I feel like it just really increased my knowledge about sports analytics and football analytics in particular. So that's like one specific example I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's been so cool to learn more about the relationships he's been a part of, and so I appreciate you highlighting that. You also said in a previous interview that you volunteer for a mentoring group for women, I believe. Can you talk about that organization and like maybe an experience you had that was meaningful for you with them?
Sure. So the organization I mentioned was called Women in Sports Tech. And so it's not specific to analytics, but specific to sports and like technology and kind of like the intersection of those two things. And so basically they help women, get opportunities within sports and like sports technology. And so my mentee worked in football, or had an internship in football. So my job was basically to like guide her through her internship and through a little bit of college. And she was like president of their sports analytics company at her college. So I got to really guide her through that and give her like advice and feedback. And I actually ran into her at a conference probably like 6 months ago. And I didn't know she was going to be there because we'd only met virtually. So that was really cool to like see her in person. And I feel like it really helped me grow as a leader, because I'm still like young in my career and I'm still learning. So I feel like it really showed me like what I have to offer as like a mentor and a leader in the community. And like my mentee also taught me a lot about like the work she was doing and like all the things she had to offer. So I feel like we both learned a lot from each other, and it was just a really beneficial experience for the both of us. And it was just a great time, but it was a professional experience, but there was no pressure there to like perform or produce anything. So it was like a really relaxed experience, and I enjoyed it a lot. That's
very cool. I love how you were talking about how Dr. Eric Eager was mentoring you, and you've been able to mentor for other people. What do you think the NFL can do to help encourage more women representation in jobs and roles in football and just the football community at large?
Yeah, I think just having more opportunities. So I know there's the Women's Forum that's at some sports analytics conference. They amplify a lot of women's voices in the NFL. They have a lot fellowships and things like that for women, which I think are great. And it's a step towards encouraging more women. And I think obviously just seeing other women in those positions helps people, say hey, I'm going to do that too. Showing that it's a safe space to work, and women are encouraged to apply. But yeah, really having those specific roles for women, I think is a great way to start. I don't have any other suggestions, I guess, just having more opportunities to connect with women in sports analytics or, football in general. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Sam Rappaport, but she works with the NFL, and she's a great role model. She really amplifies opportunities for women in sports, and specifically in the NFL. And she's just kind of really the leader of women in sports analytics, or women in football analytics in particular. So I think just having more opportunities out there is important, giving people chance. I'm not saying they should take people that aren't qualified, but saying yes to people and maybe taking more of a chance on them. I feel like people did with me, because you just never know what's going to come out of it.
If I could ask a bonus question, I've been listening to all these Sloan MIT videos, and in one of them, I recall, I'm going to paraphrase, but I think Bill James, he's great. I finally watched the Moneyball last night with my girlfriend, and I loved it. And I'd watched just parts, I think, but never watched the whole thing. And so, anyways, Bill James. At a certain point, he likes to ask questions of the panel. And so he asked the panel, and he goes, so do you think women can present a different perspective in team building that may be, like different, I guess. Yeah. Like, and I noticed that like no one on the panel was a woman, and I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you, like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the way women lead is a lot different than the way men lead, and like not saying that one is better than the other, but I think you mentioned this earlier as well, like communication is a really big part of that. And I think especially when it comes to like football, or like football teams, whether it's analytics or what have you, I think having that open communication is really important. So, everyone's on the same page and like, prevents mistakes and things like that. So I think just having more female representation in general in sports and like specifically to football, I think is just really cool. And I think although it's, obviously a male sport, like they still appreciate having other people there that like don't look like them or do different things than them. So I think just having diversity in general, whether it's in sports or not, is really important and like encourages more different ideas, opinions, thoughts, and just more discussion in general, which I think can be really productive. So you just never know like what ideas will come out of it. Like, for example, with all the new proposed rules, like for the NFL that they test in like the XFL or do in like the Pro Bowl, things like that. I think some of those ideas are really great and a lot of people agree upon, but if you don't have a discussion about it, you never know what other people's like opinions are going to be. So I think the NFL has really done a great job of continuing to amplify like female voices, especially those in like positions of power, like Kim Bagula and like other female owners or other females that are like involved in like maybe executives of teams. So I think they do a really great job of that. And I think just continuing to do all of that and just keeping women involved, because as we've seen with like Taylor Swift and all that fiasco, she's brought in like a ton of new female viewership to NFL, which is like only a good thing in my opinion. And I think the NFL recognized that as well. So I think having a more diverse crowd, whether that's like of viewers or people who work in the sport, I think it is a great thing.
Well said. Thank you. Yeah. I don't know if this is a well-founded take, but I almost want to say the salary cap recognized Taylor Swift's impact. Thank you so much, Taylor. What am I saying, Taylor? Amelia. Now I have Taylor Swift. Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to say? How can our viewers and listeners support your work going forward?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me again. This has been a great discussion. Always fun to talk about football. You can reach out to me on Twitter. My handle's just my name, at Amelia Probst. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. My profile is also on Pro Football Focus website, so pff.com. You can see my work on there. Feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to answer any questions, come on a podcast, anything like that. So happy to help any way I can.
Well, thank you so much again, Amelia. Yeah, looking forward to the future and talking again soon.
Likewise. Thanks.